Good evening, friends. Let me take you back to a moment that felt so ordinary at first, but would soon become anything but. Jacob Walker, a 17-year-old black teenager with dreams bigger than his small town, was cruising along Highway 64. The evening sun dipped low in the sky, casting a warm orange glow over the asphalt, a fiery reminder of how fleeting calm can be. His hands rested firmly on the steering wheel of his modest sedan, a car he'd saved up for by working countless hours after school. It wasn't flashy or new, but it was freedom. Every scratch on its surface told a story, his story. For just a moment, life seemed simple. Music played softly from the car speakers, something smooth and soulful, filling the silence around him. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, empty save for a few distant cars speeding by in the opposite direction. This was one of those rare moments when Jacob could breathe easy, almost forgetting about the weight of expectations, his mom's voice always echoing in his mind, "Keep your hands visible. Be polite. Don't make sudden movements." He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. If traffic stayed light, he'd be home just in time for dinner with his mom. She always worried when he was out too late. Thinking of her waiting brought a faint smile to his face. He adjusted the rearview mirror slightly, catching sight of his own reflection. His dark skin contrasted against the bright orange hues outside, his expression calm but alert. That's when he noticed them, a pair of headlights growing closer behind him. Jacob didn't think much of it at first. Cars passed all the time. But then came the flash, red and blue lights bouncing off the interior of his car like an unwelcome guest barging into a quiet room. His heart sank instantly. He checked his speedometer again. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't broken any laws. Yet here they were, the police. His pulse quickened as he signaled and pulled over onto the shoulder of the road. Gravel crunched beneath his tires as he came to a stop. Jacob turned off the engine, placed both hands tightly on the steering wheel, and took a deep breath. His chest tightened, each inhale sharp and deliberate. He watched in the side mirror as the patrol car parked behind him, its lights still flashing ominously. An officer stepped out, tall and imposing, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting the fading sunlight. "License and registration," came the cold demand. Jacob nodded, moving slowly to comply. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the glove compartment. "It's in here," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. As he handed over the documents, offering a faint smile, he asked, "Is there a problem, officer?" But even as the words left his lips, Jacob knew this wasn't going to end quickly. Something in the air shifted, subtle yet unmistakable. Fear began creeping in, settling heavily in his stomach. Good evening, friends. Let's dive deeper into the moment that changed everything for Jacob Walker. After pulling over onto the gravel shoulder of Highway 64, Jacob sat frozen in his seat, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The red and blue lights flashed ominously behind him, casting sharp shadows inside his sedan. He could feel his heart pounding like a drumbeat, each thud reverberating through his chest as he waited for the officer to approach. The first officer stepped out of the patrol car, his tall frame silhouetted against the fading golden hour light. His mirrored sunglasses reflected Jacob's anxious face as he tapped on the driver's side window with authority. Jacob rolled it down slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his voice cold and devoid of any politeness. Jacob nodded, reaching cautiously into the glove compartment. His fingers trembled slightly as he handed over the documents, offering a faint smile. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, trying to sound confident but failing to mask the nervousness creeping into his tone. The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at Jacob's license for what felt like an eternity before glancing back at him. "You own this car?" Jacob nodded again, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "Yes, sir." But something shifted in the air. The officer's lips twitched into something resembling a smirk, a look that sent chills down Jacob's spine. Without warning, the questions escalated. They weren't just asking about the car anymore, they were accusing him. "Step out of the vehicle," one of them barked. Jacob hesitated, panic rising in his chest. "Why? I haven't done anything." But the officers weren't listening. Their tone hardened, their posture stiffened, and within moments, Jacob found himself cuffed and pressed face down into the gravel. The rough surface bit into his cheek, and the tightness of the handcuffs dug painfully into his wrists. His breathing grew shallow and ragged as fear overwhelmed him. How had this escalated so quickly? He hadn't been speeding. He hadn't resisted. He had followed every instruction. Yet here he was, humiliated and terrified, wondering if anyone would ever believe he did nothing wrong. Jacob's mind raced, replaying every second of the interaction that had led him here. He thought about his mom's warnings, how she always told him to keep his hands visible, be polite, don't make sudden movements. He had done all of that. So why was this happening? As he lay there, the sound of approaching engines reached his ears. At first, he thought it might be another patrol car arriving to join the chaos. But then he heard the distinct rumble of multiple vehicles, powerful engines moving with precision. The officers must have noticed too because they both turned their heads toward the road. 3 black SUVs appeared in the distance, their tinted windows gleaming in the fading sunlight. They slowed as they approached the scene, parking strategically to block the patrol car from view. Doors opened in unison, and men in dark suits stepped out, scanning the area with practiced precision. And then, he stepped out. Donald Trump, former President of the United States, emerged from the lead vehicle with an unreadable expression. His polished shoes crunched softly against the gravel as he walked toward the chaos unfolding before him. Trump's gaze swept over the scene, Jacob lying on the ground, the officers standing stiffly nearby. His eyes narrowed slightly, locking onto the handcuffs binding Jacob's wrists. Without hesitation, he demanded answers. What's his crime? The question hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Good evening, friends. Let's dive deeper into the moment that changed everything for Jacob Walker. He was lying face down on the gravel shoulder of Highway 64, his cheek pressed against the rough surface, feeling every jagged edge bite into his skin. The cuffs were tight, too tight, and they dug painfully into his wrists. His breathing came in shallow gasps, each inhale sharp and ragged. Fear pulsed through him like a relentless tide he couldn't push back. The officers stood nearby, their earlier bravado still lingering as they rifled through his belongings. One of them muttered something under his breath about kids these days, but Jacob didn't catch it fully. All he could focus on was the humiliation washing over him, the way they had treated him like a criminal without any real justification. He replayed the scene in his mind, pulling over calmly, handing over his license and registration politely, complying with every order. Yet here he was, face down on the side of the road, handcuffed and powerless. But then something shifted. An unexpected sound broke through the tension. It started faintly, almost drowned out by the officer's movements and the distant hum of passing cars. A low rumble grew louder with each passing second. Jacob's heart raced even faster as he realized what it was. Engines. Multiple engines. 3 sleek black SUVs appeared in the distance, their tinted windows gleaming ominously in the fading golden hour light. They slowed as they approached, parking strategically to block the patrol car from view. The officers froze, their confidence crumbling instantly. Men in dark suits emerged from the vehicles, moving with practiced precision. Their polished shoes crunched softly against the gravel, contrasting sharply with the tense atmosphere. And then, he stepped out. Donald Trump, former President of the United States, walked toward the chaos with an unreadable expression. His presence commanded attention immediately. Trump's gaze swept over the scene, Jacob lying on the ground, the officers standing stiffly nearby. His eyes narrowed slightly, locking onto the handcuffs binding Jacob's wrists. Without hesitation, he demanded answers. What's his crime? The question hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. The officers stammered, their excuses falling apart under scrutiny. Trump didn't wait for them to finish. With a firm tone that brooked no argument, he ordered, "Take those cuffs off him." One of the officers hesitated but complied reluctantly, unlocking the cuffs with a harsh click. Jacob winced as blood rushed back into his sore wrists, his fingers trembling as he rubbed them. As soon as the cuffs came off, Trump gestured toward one of the men in his security detail. "Get him some water," he instructed. An agent nodded and retrieved a bottle from one of the SUVs, handing it to Jacob. Jacob took it with shaky hands, murmuring a quiet thank you. His voice trembled, betraying the mix of emotions swirling inside him: relief, gratitude, disbelief. Trump folded his arms, turning his attention back to the officers. "What's your name?" he asked the taller officer. "Officer Grant, sir," came the reply, stiff and defensive. Trump's gaze shifted to the shorter officer. "And yours?" "Daniels, sir," the man replied, barely above a whisper. "You two know who I am," Trump stated, not waiting for confirmation. Both officers nodded quickly, clearly aware they were now under intense scrutiny. "Good. Then you should also know that what I just saw is unacceptable." His tone hardened, slicing through the tension like a blade. "You humiliated that boy. You profiled him. And you treated him like a criminal without any evidence. That's not policing, that's abuse of power." Grant tried to defend himself, his voice wavering slightly. "Sir, we were just doing our job," but Trump cut him off mid-sentence. "Your job? Your job is to protect and serve, not to intimidate and humiliate." He took a step closer, his expression unyielding. "Tell me, did you even ask for his registration, or did you jump straight to putting him in handcuffs?" Neither officer responded. Their silence spoke volumes. Trump exhaled sharply, shaking his head in disgust. "That's what I thought." Trump turned back to Jacob, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay, son?" Jacob nodded slowly, still trying to process everything that had happened. Yeah, I'm okay, sir. Thank you." Trump's expression softened slightly. "Call your mom. Let her know you're safe." Jacob pulled out his phone, his hand still trembling as he dialed his mother's number. As the call connected, Trump stepped aside, giving Jacob a moment of privacy. While Jacob spoke to his mom, Trump addressed his security team. "I want their badge numbers and the name of their supervisor. Make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." One of the agents nodded, approaching the officers to collect the necessary information. Grant and Daniels exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier arrogance replaced by visible unease. When Jacob ended the call, Trump returned to his side. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "This isn't over. You've been through something no one should have to go through, but you handled yourself well. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Jacob nodded again, his resolve strengthening. "Thank you, Mr. Trump. Really." Trump gave him a small smile. "Stay safe out there." With that, he turned and walked back toward the convoy of black SUVs, his security detail following closely behind. As the vehicles pulled away, Jacob stood there, watching them disappear into the distance. The sound of their engines faded, leaving only the faint hum of evening traffic and the chirping of crickets in the background. Jacob glanced at the officers, who were now standing stiffly to the side, their expressions a mix of shame and unease. He climbed back into his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he tried to steady his breathing. The fear and humiliation he had felt moments ago were still fresh in his mind, but they were slowly being replaced by a sense of relief and determination. Good evening, friends. Let's dive deeper into the moment that would define not just Jacob Walker's life, but also ignite a national conversation about justice and accountability. After Donald Trump ordered the handcuffs removed and reassured Jacob that he was safe, the former president turned his attention back to the officers who had caused this chaos, Grant and Daniels. Their earlier bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by stiff postures and nervous glances at each other. They knew they were now under intense scrutiny. Trump folded his arms across his chest, his expression stern as he addressed them directly. "What's your name?" he asked Officer Grant, his voice firm but controlled. The taller officer hesitated before answering, "Officer Grant, sir." Trump nodded slowly, his gaze piercing as if sizing up every word. Then he turned to the shorter officer. "And yours?" "Daniels, sir," came the reply, barely above a whisper. "You two know who I am," Trump stated, not waiting for confirmation. Both officers nodded quickly, clearly aware they were now under intense scrutiny. "Good. Then you should also know that what I just saw here is unacceptable." His tone hardened, slicing through the tension like a blade. "You humiliated that boy. You profiled him. And you treated him like a criminal without any evidence. That's not policing, that's abuse of power." Grant tried to defend himself, his voice wavering slightly. "Sir, we were just doing our job," but Trump cut him off mid-sentence. "Your job? Your job is to protect and serve, not to intimidate and humiliate." He took a step closer, his expression unyielding. "Tell me, did you even ask for his registration, or did you jump straight to putting him in handcuffs?" Neither officer responded. Their silence spoke volumes. Trump exhaled sharply, shaking his head in disgust. "That's what I thought." Good evening, friends. Let's dive deeper into what happened next in Jacob Walker's story. By the time Jacob pulled into his driveway, the adrenaline from a highway encounter was still coursing through him. His hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel as he parked the car and turned off the engine. The house he'd grown up in stood before him, its warm yellow siding glowing faintly under the porch light, but Jacob felt far from calm. He sat there for a moment, staring at the front door, trying to steady his breathing. His mom opened the door before he even stepped out of the car. Her face was a mix of relief and concern as she rushed toward him, pulling him into a tight hug. "I'm so glad you're okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jacob hugged her back, feeling the weight of everything settle onto his shoulders. "I'm okay, Mom. I'm really okay." They went inside, and Jacob sank into a chair at the kitchen table. His hands were still shaking as his mom poured him a glass of water and sat across from him. "Tell me everything," she said softly, her eyes never leaving his face. Jacob recounted every detail: the stop, the accusations, the handcuffs, and then the arrival of Donald Trump. His mom listened intently, her expression shifting from shock to anger to relief. When he finished, she reached across the table and took his hands in hers. "You're safe now," she said firmly. "That's all that matters." But even as those words hung in the air, Jacob couldn't escape the lingering thought, this isn't over. By the next morning, it became clear just how right he was. The story of Jacob's encounter with the police, and Donald Trump's dramatic intervention, had spread like wildfire. Social media platforms buzzed with videos and posts about what had happened on that quiet stretch of Highway 64. News outlets picked up the story quickly, each adding their own spin to the narrative. Headlines like Trump stands up against racial profiling and former president defends black teen from police abuse flooded the internet and television screens across the country. Jacob sat at the kitchen table with his mom, his phone buzzing nonstop with notifications. Messages, likes, shares. It was overwhelming. Someone must have recorded the encounter because clips of Trump stepping out of his SUV, confronting the officers, and standing by Jacob's side were everywhere. People were calling it a turning point, a powerful moment that highlighted the ongoing issue of racial profiling. As Jacob scrolled through his feed, he noticed something else. Hashtags like #JusticeForJacob and #EndRacialProfiling were trending nationwide. Protesters began gathering outside police departments, holding signs demanding accountability for officers like Grant and Daniels. Activists used the incident as a rallying cry, calling for sweeping reforms in law enforcement practices. It wasn't just about Jacob anymore, it was about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. But with the support came backlash. Some people accused Jacob of exaggerating the encounter or using it to gain attention. Others criticized Trump's involvement, claiming it was nothing more than a publicity stunt. Jacob tried to focus on the positive messages, but the negativity still nibbled at him. Suddenly, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen, his eyes widening when he saw the name displayed. "Mom, it's him," Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who?" his mom asked, leaning closer. "Donald Trump." Her eyes widened in surprise. "Well, don't just sit there, answer it." Jacob took a deep breath and swiped to answer. "Hello." "Jacob, it's Donald Trump. How are you doing today?" Trump's voice was calm but firm. Jacob nodded, though Trump couldn't see him. I'm okay, sir. Thank you. Good evening, friends." Let's dive deeper into the moment that would redefine Jacob Walker's role in a movement much bigger than himself. Days had passed since the viral explosion of his story, and Jacob was still adjusting to the whirlwind of attention. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications, messages from strangers, news outlets requesting interviews, and activists praising his courage. But amidst the chaos, there was one call Jacob never expected. It came late in the afternoon, just as he was helping his mom clear the dinner table. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the television in the living room, where a news channel replayed footage of Donald Trump stepping out of his SUV during that fateful highway encounter. Jacob glanced at his phone, its screen lighting up with an incoming call. The name displayed made his breath hitch. Donald Trump. "Mom, it's him," Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked up from the sink, her hands dripping with soapy water. "Who?" she asked, leaning closer. "Donald Trump," Jacob replied, still staring at the screen. "Well, don't just sit there, answer it," she urged, drying her hands on a towel. Jacob took a deep breath and swiped to answer. "Hello." "Jacob, it's Donald Trump. How are you doing today?" Trump's voice was calm but firm, carrying the same authority Jacob remembered from their first meeting. I'm okay, sir. Thank you," Jacob stammered, still trying to process the fact that he was speaking directly to the former president of the United States. "I've been following the news," Trump continued. "I wanted to make sure you're holding up all right. I know it's a lot to process." Jacob nodded, though Trump couldn't see him. "Yeah, it's been overwhelming. I can imagine. But you handled yourself well out there. I saw it firsthand." Jacob's grip tightened slightly on the phone. "Thank you, sir. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stopped." "That's exactly why I stopped," Trump said firmly. "Because I knew what could have happened. And that's why we need to make sure something comes out of this. It can't just be another story that fades away." Jacob felt a surge of gratitude. "I agree." Good, Trump said. Now listen, there's going to be a lot of attention on you in the coming days. People will want to hear your side of the story. But I want you to remember one thing. This isn't just about you. It's about everyone who's ever been in your position, people who didn't have someone there to step in. Jacob nodded again, his resolve strengthening. I understand. Good, Trump said. We're going to keep the pressure on. I've already spoken to the Department of Justice. They're launching an investigation into the officers who stopped you. And I've made it clear that I expect real accountability. Jacob glanced at his mom, who was watching him with a mixture of pride and concern. Do you think they'll actually face consequences? They will, Trump said firmly. I won't let this slide. We're also pushing for reforms to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else. Jacob felt a lump form in his throat. Thank you, Mr. Trump. Really? Trump's voice softened slightly. Don't thank me. Just keep speaking the truth. People are listening. When the call ended, Jacob sat in silence for a moment, processing everything. His mom leaned forward, her eyes shining with emotion. Jacob, do you realize what just happened? You're part of something big. Jacob nodded slowly. I know. The next few days are going to be crazy. Good evening, friends. Let's dive deeper into the moment when Jacob Walker stepped into a courtroom that would become the epicenter of a national debate. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation as news crews lined the streets outside, capturing every movement. Protesters held signs demanding justice for Jacob and accountability for officers like Grant and Daniels. Inside, the atmosphere was charged, severe yet hopeful, as people filled every available seat. Jacob sat quietly next to his mother, both dressed in formal attire. His hands fidgeted nervously in his lap, palms slightly sweaty, but his gaze remained steady. He refused to let the nervous energy overtake him. His mother placed a reassuring hand on his arm, giving him a small nod of encouragement. Then, Donald Trump entered the courtroom, flanked by his security detail. The entire room shifted as he walked in, commanding attention. He acknowledged Jacob with a brief nod before taking his seat. The judge entered, and the courtroom rose to its feet. Once everyone was seated again, the proceedings began. The charges against officers Grant and Daniels were read aloud: excessive use of force, racial profiling, and misconduct. Both officers sat stiffly at the defense table, their earlier arrogance replaced by tension and fear. The prosecution began with opening statements, laying out the events of that day in meticulous detail. They described how Jacob had been pulled over without cause, treated like a criminal despite doing nothing wrong, and how the officers had escalated the situation unnecessarily. They painted a clear picture of racial profiling, highlighting the systemic issues within law enforcement. When it was time for Jacob to take the stand, he felt a wave of anxiety wash over him. He took a deep breath and stood, walking slowly to the witness box. As he sat down, he glanced at the crowd and saw familiar faces: his mother, Donald Trump, and even some of the protesters who had shown up to support him. Their presence gave him strength. The prosecutor approached him with a kind expression. Jacob, can you tell the court what happened to you on the day you were pulled over? Jacob nodded, his voice steady but firm. I was driving home. I wasn't speeding or breaking any laws. I saw the police lights behind me, so I pulled over. And what happened after you pulled over? Jacob's hands tightened around the edges of the witness box. The officer asked for my license and registration. I gave it to him, and he started asking me questions like whether I owned the car, where I was going. Then he told me to step out of the car. Did you feel that was necessary? Jacob shook his head. No, I wasn't doing anything wrong, but I complied because I was scared. Good evening, friends. Let's dive deeper into one of the most pivotal moments of the trial, when Donald Trump himself took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as he walked confidently to the witness box, his presence commanding attention. Everyone leaned forward slightly, hanging on his every word. The prosecutor began by asking him to describe what he had witnessed that day on Highway 64. "I saw a young man being treated unfairly," Trump said, his voice steady and authoritative. He was lying on the ground in handcuffs while the officers rummaged through his belongings without cause. It was clear to me that he was being profiled. His words carried weight, each sentence punctuated with conviction. The prosecutor nodded, pressing further. "What made you stop your motorcade that day?" "Because it was the right thing to do," Trump replied firmly, leaning forward slightly for emphasis. "I saw an injustice happening, and I wasn't going to drive by and ignore it. Too many people have done that for too long." The room seemed to hold its breath as Trump spoke, his tone unyielding yet sincere. When the defense attorney stood to cross-examine Trump, there was a noticeable shift in the air. The attorney approached cautiously, clearly aware of the challenge ahead. "Mr. Trump," he began, his voice laced with skepticism, "you've been accused by some of using this incident for political gain. How do you respond to that?" Trump didn't flinch. "This isn't about politics. It's about doing what's right. And if people want to criticize me for standing up against injustice, they can. I'll still do it." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, but the judge quickly called for silence. The defense attorney pressed on, trying to undermine Trump's credibility. "But surely you understand that your presence has influenced public opinion?" "Of course," Trump responded, nodding. "That's the point. People need to see that someone is willing to stand up and say, 'Enough is enough.' If my involvement brings attention to this issue, then so be it." The defense attorney hesitated, realizing he wasn't gaining ground. After a few more weak attempts to challenge Trump, he ended his questioning abruptly, clearly defeated. As Trump stepped down from the witness box, the courtroom buzzed with energy. Protesters outside held signs reading "Justice for Jacob" and "Accountability Now." Their chants echoed faintly through the courthouse windows, blending with the tension inside. Jacob sat quietly next to his mother, feeling a mix of awe and gratitude. For the first time, he truly believed justice might prevail. Good evening, friends. Let's dive deeper into the moment that would define not just Jacob Walker's life, but also ignite a national conversation about justice and accountability. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as news crews lined the streets outside, capturing every movement. Protesters held signs demanding justice for Jacob and accountability for officers like Grant and Daniels. Inside, the atmosphere was charged, severe yet hopeful, as people filled every available seat. Jacob sat quietly next to his mother, both dressed in formal attire. His hands fidgeted nervously in his lap, palms slightly sweaty, but his gaze remained steady. He refused to let the nervous energy overtake him. His mother placed a reassuring hand on his arm, giving him a small nod of encouragement. Then, Donald Trump entered the courtroom, flanked by his security detail. The entire room shifted as he walked in, commanding attention. He acknowledged Jacob with a brief nod before taking his seat. The judge entered, and the courtroom rose to its feet. Once everyone was seated again, the proceedings began. The charges against officers Grant and Daniels were read aloud: excessive use of force, racial profiling, and misconduct. Both officers sat stiffly at the defense table, their earlier arrogance replaced by tension and fear. The prosecution began with opening statements, laying out the events of that day in meticulous detail. They described how Jacob had been pulled over without cause, treated like a criminal despite doing nothing wrong, and how the officers had escalated the situation unnecessarily. They painted a clear picture of racial profiling, highlighting the systemic issues within law enforcement. When it was time for Jacob to take the stand, he felt a wave of anxiety wash over him. He took a deep breath and stood, walking slowly to the witness box. As he sat down, he glanced at the crowd and saw familiar faces: his mother, Donald Trump, and even some of the protesters who had shown up to support him. Their presence gave him strength. The prosecutor approached him with a kind expression. "Jacob, can you tell the court what happened to you on the day you were pulled over?" Jacob nodded, his voice steady but firm. "I was driving home. I wasn't speeding or breaking any laws. I saw the police lights behind me, so I pulled over." "And what happened after you pulled over?" Jacob's hands tightened around the edges of the witness box. "The officer asked for my license and registration. I gave it to him, and he started asking me questions like whether I owned the car, where I was going. Then he told me to step out of the car." "Did you feel that was necessary?" Jacob shook his head. "No, I wasn't doing anything wrong, but I complied because I was scared." Good evening, friends. Let's dive deeper into the moment when Jacob Walker truly embraced his role as a catalyst for change. In the weeks following the trial, Jacob found himself at the center of a national conversation about racial profiling and police accountability. The guilty verdict against Officers Grant and Daniels was celebrated as a monumental victory, not just for Jacob but for countless others who had faced similar injustices without resolution. Protesters held signs reading "Justice for Jacob" and "Accountability Now" outside courthouses across the country, their chants echoing through city streets. Jacob spent his days speaking at conferences, testifying before Congress, and sharing his story with students. Each time he stood in front of an audience, he felt a mix of nerves and determination. His voice carried weight, resonating with people who had experienced systemic injustice firsthand. Messages poured in from strangers, some thanking him for giving them courage, others sharing their own harrowing encounters with law enforcement. One message stood out to him: "Because of you, I finally reported what happened to me. Seeing you stand up gave me hope." One evening, after returning home from a particularly emotional testimony on Capitol Hill, Jacob sat on the couch with his mom. She handed him a mug of tea, her eyes filled with pride. "You've been through more than anyone should ever have to," she said softly. "But look at you now, you're making a difference." Jacob nodded, though his mind was still processing everything that had happened. "I just keep thinking about how many people don't get this kind of outcome," he admitted. "How many people don't have someone like Trump to step in and help?" His mom placed a reassuring hand on his knee. "That's why you need to keep using your voice. People are listening now. You can make a difference." Before Jacob could respond, there was a knock at the door. When they opened it, Donald Trump stood there, flanked by two security agents. "Mr. Trump," Jacob's mom said, her voice tinged with surprise. "Please come in." Trump stepped inside, offering a polite nod. "Thank you, ma'am." Once seated, Trump leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. "You've handled yourself well, Jacob. Not everyone would have the strength to go through what you did and come out stronger." Jacob shrugged modestly. "I didn't feel strong at the time. I was scared." "That's what makes it impressive," Trump replied firmly. "You were scared, but you didn't let it stop you. That's real courage." They talked for hours, discussing ways Jacob could continue advocating for reform. As Trump prepared to leave, he shook Jacob's hand firmly. "Stay in touch, and if you ever need anything, you know how to reach me." After Trump left, Jacob sat back down on the couch, his mind racing with possibilities. He realized he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly.
And that's where our story ends. What did you think of this story? Share your emotions in the comments below. We'd love to know what you remember most. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And if you are in the mood for another exciting story, check out our next video. It's waiting for you. Until then, stay curious, get inspired, and keep exploring the stories that make life extraordinary. See you in the next one.